Hi, everybody, and we are here with Andy Diamond, the Director of Student Ministries at Bethel Presbyterian, and he's going to be with us for several chapters through our our journey through the Gospel of Mark in this sermon series, Encountering Jesus and Walking in His Ways. So, Andy, thank you for being here and talking us through some of these chapters. Tonight we're looking at, or today, whenever you're watching this, we're looking at Mark chapter 2. And I would love to hear just some of your insights and what stood out to you in this chapter.
Yeah, so I absolutely love Mark chapter 2. First of all, it has one of my favorite stories in the Gospel of Mark, which is the story of Jesus healing the paralytic at Capernaum. But I think Mark chapter 2 also sets the tone for the structure that Mark sets up for his gospel. I think you see at the end of chapter 8 sort of a drastic shift that goes along with Peter's profession of the Christ. And so from chapter 2 until chapter 8, you see Mark asserting that Jesus is the king. He has authority, he has power, he's performing miracles and healings. And then you see it shift starting in chapter 9 to Jesus as the suffering servant as he goes towards Jerusalem and ultimately towards the cross. And so here in chapter 2, you see Jesus healing a paralytic. You see Jesus calling Matthew, speaking about fasting and about the Sabbath. And you see Jesus assert himself as King and Lord. And you also see through the teaching about the paralytic and about tax collectors and sinners that no one is outside of God's love and God's capacity to save. I love that about Mark 2.
And in that same vein, were there convicting teachings in chapter 2 that really kind of struck a chord with you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I love the teaching of the paralytic in Capernaum. You know, this is not the first time Jesus has been to Capernaum. We saw in chapter 1, he was teaching in the synagogue in this city, and the people marveled at the power and authority with which he taught. And so when he returns to the city, you see him fill a whole house. There is a giant crowd there to see him speak, so much so that it's overflowing out of the house into the yard or the street. And so there are these friends who bring their paralyzed friend. They carry him on a mat because they want to get him in front of Jesus because they recognize that Jesus has the power to heal. But unfortunately for them, this large crowd has gathered. And so they, because of their great faith, but also because of their love for their friend and because their recognition of Jesus's power, they dig through the ceiling just so that they can get their friend in front of Jesus, who is ultimately healed and has his sins forgiven. And it's a great reminder for me of Jesus's power to save, that this paralytic who culture, society viewed as having been paralyzed or stricken because of his sin or his parents' sin, and therefore being outside of God's love, that he is not outside of God's love. No one is outside of God's love and capacity to save, but also it's convicting to me because it challenges me on whether or not I view my friends that way, whether or not I view people in my life as lost souls who need saving, or if I have great enough faith to do whatever it takes to bring them to the feet of Jesus. And so that's really convicting for me because I think I don't always think of people that way.
Absolutely. And the other thing here with that is not only what he did in the healing of the paralytic, but then also how he then scolded the other folks that were there, that, as he says here in chapter 2, reasoning in their hearts as to what he did. And they actually accuse him of blaspheming because he forgave the sins of the paralytic, and they say, God's the only one that can do that.
Right.
And then what he says to them afterwards, after that, is just another knock. And what we're kind of seeing here in Mark is this establishment of authority, of Jesus' kingly authority. And Mark he does not waste time in showing us these scenes where these great miracles are happening and the grace and compassion is happening, but also who it is that's doing this.
Right. Yeah. And that is something we see in Mark 2. You know, this is an entirely new thing that's happening. This is not just another rabbi who's teaching, but in chapter 1, the people are amazed by the authority with which Jesus teaches. And in chapter 2, we have the analogy of new wine and old wineskins. And, you know, you understand for maybe the first time as you read through this, that God is doing a new thing. You know, this is not a continuation necessarily of the Jewish law. This is a fulfillment of prophecy. This is something new that God is doing and bringing into the world. And Jesus is teaching with a new authority. And I love the way he challenges the self-righteousness of the Pharisees in verse 17. You know, when they're talking about how dare you eat in the house of tax collectors and sinners, and why would you choose a tax collector, Levi, Matthew, to be one of your followers? And Jesus says really plainly, listen, it's not the healthy that need a doctor, it's the sick. You know, and not that the Pharisees were spiritually healthy, but they viewed themselves that way.
Right.
They were not people who would have thought they needed help.
Yeah.
And Jesus is quick to reach out to the people who need help.
I also thought it was interesting that he says, I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. Other times in the gospel, being called righteous is actually okay.
Yeah.
Like you want to be the righteousness of God. But here, Jesus' use of righteousness seems very tongue-in-cheek.
It's almost a slap in the face. To the
Exactly.
Pharisees.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Well, what about follow me? Talk to me about follow me. Because once again, here in chapter 2, we have another follow me command from Jesus. And it's Matthew, and he immediately does it.
Yeah.
Just like in chapter 1, the fishers of men, they immediately follow. What is it about that statement that incites people to immediately follow?
Yes, there is a radical obedience that you see on the part of the disciples. And there is some of God's call in that, certainly, but also, they were not people who cared about what they were leaving behind. They were quick to drop what they were doing. He called the fishermen out of the boat. Mm-hmm. He calls Levi out of the tax collector's booth. He is literally at his place of employment. And Jesus says, come follow me. And this may not have been the first time that Matthew encountered Jesus. He had been in this place before. Perhaps Matthew had heard Jesus teach and understood his authority. But when Jesus calls him and asks him to follow him, Matthew is quick. He drops what he's doing and he goes. And I think you see that as a hallmark of Jesus' disciples. They are not looking to serve themselves or serve their old masters and serve Jesus. They're quick to make that break from their old life and embrace what Jesus has for them. And I think it's a great reminder for us that we're called to do the same thing.
In that same vein, and one of the questions that we've been asked, that we're going to ask throughout each of these chapter videos, and it's kind of like our tagline for this sermon series and for our study, is how does this chapter challenge us to walk in the ways of Christ? Jumping on that last statement that you just said about obedience, how do you see this chapter challenging us to walk in Christ's ways?
Yeah, well, I think the sense that no one is outside of God's capacity to love and save is a great challenge for us, because like the men at Capernaum bringing their paralyzed friend, and like the friends of Matthew who may have known him and never thought of him as someone who's religious. I think there are people in our lives who we view as for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of their lifestyle or their circumstance. Maybe they have rejected the church before. We view them as outside of God's capacity to save. We say things like, oh, so-and-so, he'd never come to church. God would never save him. He'd never be interested in hearing about my faith. And it's a great reminder to us that even people who we view as the furthest out and the most lost among our family or friends, they are not outside of God's grace. They are not outside of God's capacity to save. And so our job in the midst of that is to be obedient in sharing our faith with them and living our life in front of them, being the aroma of Christ to them, and allowing God to enter their life, or God to call them as he sees fit. But for us, just the obedience to not view people as the world views them, but to think of them as God thinks of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us about Mark chapter 2. And as you guys get ready to talk with your small groups, we hope that what we've shared with you here a little bit may enlighten some of the discussion. But thank you again, Andy. And Andy, again, he'll be with us for several other chapters, so look forward to that. But have a great meeting time together.